only China can dub one of the bloodiest military coups in our modern history as a mere cabinet reshuffle. When you have trillions online in a mega project like the Belt Road Initiative, you would want anything to go your way. So when China's economic presence in Myanmar got threatened by its 2021 civil war, it did what it does best. Backed the heck out of the coup and kick-started its own plan to control the war-torn company. And this has everything to do with Beijing's West Coast dreams. Let's jump right into it. Western media doesn't have a knack for reporting human rights abuses happening anywhere other than Europe or America. So while the world was witnessing the Russian atrocities in Ukraine, Myanmar's citizens were fighting a coup at its apex. And perhaps one of the greatest attacks on democracy, Myanmar's military, Tatmadaw, overturned the results of 2020 general elections. You see, the country knows all about living under a restricted military regime, and they're not the biggest fans. So when the proponents of democracy started a campaign to sideline the military in 2015, the support they got from the public was immense. It was quite obvious. Citizens wanted its military to do what it was supposed to do, protect the country and not run it. Thank you very much. But since Tatmadaw has been in power for decades now, they weren't very keen on letting it go. So what happens next isn't surprising. It's chapter 1 of the centuries-old book of how to stage a coup d'etat. Even though Suu Kyi was all set to rule the country and won the 2020 elections by a landslide, the junta declared the elections to be fraudulent. And well, it doesn't matter if they had substantive proof to back their claims or not. For them, the law is blind. Other than being elected, her crimes allegedly included importing illegal security tech into the country and breaching state emergency laws on COVID-19. Something very similar happened to the country's president, Win Myint. As the nationwide struggle between the citizens and junta broke out, it was obvious that the civil war was going to be bloody. Now in 2023, in the aftermath of military takeover, Myanmar is recording grotesque human rights violations. The junta is going to lengths to suppress any political dissent, and people were hoping for an international intervention to start the negotiation process between the National Unity Government of Myanmar and the junta. But hey, what's the incentive of ending the war when China got everything it needs? It's not a plot twist anyone didn't see coming. Sure, China shares a border with Myanmar, but Xi Jinping has no plans of intervening in the war-torn country. Here's why. If there's one song that China can really belt out, is its policy of non-interference. Beijing is always choppy about its foreign policy, but one promise it likes to keep is its mantra. Hey, just don't interfere with what we do to our people, and we won't ask any questions from you. It's simple. China isn't interested in what goes on with the country's internal policies, human rights abuse, or their military campaign as long as business is good. However, over the years, Xi Jinping has always kept its promise quite rhetorically. His interference in territorial matters of Russia tell us a different story. The leader supreme wants things to go right for his mega project to work. We're of course talking about the Belt Road Initiative that hasn't put enough money where its mouth is. So far, a major chunk of the BRI merely exists on paper, and Xi aims on taking every necessary step to make sure its crown jewel sees the light of day. Back when the military coup in Myanmar was still gaining momentum, the National Unity Government had found its messiah in China. As both of the countries had gone back and forth to strike some economic deals, Xi Jinping was worried that every move had gone in vain. When the officials in Beijing called the junta's coup as military irrationality, there was some hope for Aung San Suu Kyi's government. But then Myanmar's civil war got into the way of China's major economic lockdown in the war-torn country, including their big trade corridor. Then, in the move that everyone saw coming, Beijing simply dismissed the war in Myanmar and the junta's horrifying crimes as a mere cabinet reshuffle. The Chinese Communist Party announced that for them, the civil war in Myanmar is another Tuesday in the world of business deals. And quite dramatically, the regime accelerated its support for the junta just as it had put in quite a bit of resources for Russia's war in Ukraine. Clearly, China's non-intervention policy exists in principle only. It has one big plan on its to-do list, and that's maintaining its regional economic sovereignty while it makes money moves for a global takeover. And Myanmar is the king in China's winning play of chess. Here's the thing. Junta isn't interested in getting rid of the trade deals that their democratic predecessors had signed. They already knew that the West is going to reprimand them for flipping the elections and all the heinous crimes they'll commit in the country. So the junta made sure to appease China in a number of diplomatic meetings it had. And Beijing went to Myanmar while bearing gifts. The CCP's love for authoritative regimes aside, the military leader, Min Aung Hlaing, had assured Beijing of two critical things. First, the war won't come to their shared border, and second, the China-Myanmar economic corridor wouldn't pause its operations. As far as China was concerned, this was the offer it couldn't refuse. And this is where Xi Jinping saw an opportunity to embark an insane plan in a country that seemed desperate for allies. The plan to control Myanmar aligns with China's obsession with making nations subject to its notorious debt trap. It's almost ingenious. As the CCP moved to help the junta financially and logistically, Myanmar isn't getting out of China's control. It has to bet a lot on the success of the economic corridor, and it can only happen when it does everything Beijing asks for. After all, there's a war to win, and you can't do that without allies. As the West closed its resources for the junta, Xi Jinping made weapon deals with Min Aung Hlaing openly. Around the world, governments were blocking the sales of weapons to the junta to limit their war crimes against its own people. And that's when China sold light airplanes, combat aircrafts, and other brutal weapon systems to Myanmar. Rumor has it some combat systems in the sale are forbidden to use under international law. But like every other atrocity in the country, this was pushed under the rug too. Yet selling weapons isn't the only stake that China has in Myanmar. It's no spoiler alert. Everything China does, it has a not-so-hidden ulterior motive to control at least one piece of global trade. The strategic, geographical positioning of Myanmar is ideal in fulfilling Beijing's West Coast dreams. The country has access to both Western and Indian waters through its coast, and when it became obvious that the West would have limited interest in Myanmar given their turbulent military, China stepped in. The CCP's main interest in the country is to gain access to the Indian Ocean and get its hands on a dual-use deep-sea port in Kiok Phiu and Myanmar's west coast. As China builds the port in Myanmar, its rivals in the West and Asia would have worries of their own. Not only would the country have a perfect route to increase its military presence in the South China Sea, it would have greater securitization of its trade route. Finally, China could ditch the Malacca Strait, the hub of the United States military presence. And that's nothing short of a Christmas wonder for the CCP. Since China's 80% of energy imports as well as other manufactured goods move along these highly contested and narrow sea routes, it's looking for a cleaner way out. And the authoritative presence of the junta will give Beijing just that. So, what's not to like? Through the corridor, China also aims to build roads, railway routes, and highly sophisticated economic zones and industrial units that'll connect the country's southwest border with Myanmar's west coast. Now, that means the CCP has landed a gold mine. First things first, the regime would have no problem with solving the energy and employment crisis in its southwestern province. And when it's done with that, it'll move on to make Myanmar the heart of its routes to markers in South Asia, West Asia, East Africa, and Europe. China has invested insane amounts in the war-torn country to have easy access to profitable markets, that too with no Western influence. As long as the junta keeps up with its antics, democratic countries like the US won't be keen on striking any bilateral trade deals with Myanmar. That leaves the military regime to fall back on China and China only. Xi Jinping has all the incentive to capitalize on its neighbor's resources on China's terms that reek of exploitation. Myanmar would invest in the corridor as Beijing continues to pump money in the country. Who knows when and how the CCP will make the junta pay? Do you think China's economic deals with Myanmar are warning signs for the South China Sea crisis? Let us know in the comments below, and we'll see you soon.